What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So today I want to talk to you about an evolved taxonomy of psychological traits or adaptations, right? So general evolutionary psychology run through what features of the human mind have evolved to adapt to certain situations. Let's look. This is based on a paper here, pretty much by the same name, right? A proposed taxonomy of human evolved psychological adaptations. So going forward, we talk a lot about sex in evolutionary psychology, right? That's a very common theme, right? Sexual selection. Who is attractive to who? Why? And why did those things evolve to be attractive? But evolution isn't just sexual selection, is it? It's also natural selection. There are adaptations in the human body that facilitate survival, reproduction, right? And there are also adaptations in the human mind that facilitate the same. So given that it's not all related to attractiveness, sex, that kind of thing, there are other ones. And I don't know how well you guys are going to be able to see this list, but I'll go down. And these are some of the ones related to natural selection, okay? First one on the list here, it says a wariness around snakes. And this is really interesting. And it's actually not just snakes, but there may also be an evolved wariness around other animals that are dangerous, particularly insects as well. This is something that has been demonstrated in classical conditioning research for decades and decades and decades. We know, for example, that snakes, insects, and also stimuli that are more modern, like syringes or guns, can be used as what's called a prepared conditioned stimulus. And that means that if you pair that stimulus with like an electric shock, people will develop a fear response to that more quickly in these classical conditioning paradigms. Classical conditioning, of course, like Pavlov, right? The dog. You pair a stimuli that is neutral with an aversive sensation, which, you know, in the case of the dog was the food and the bell, but often in research you use a little device that gives an electric shock. So snakes are one, and you even see kind of babies demonstrate an instinctive fear of these in infancy. So why would that evolve? Well, dangerous animals, right? People that were less afraid of them, maybe they got bitten and they died. And people that were more afraid, yeah. So that's something that might just get passed on. What's another one? The sensation of pain, right? People that don't experience pain. There's very few of those, but some people do have disorders that lead them to not experience pain at all. And that causes a lot of problems for them throughout their lives. You might think not feeling pain would be great, right? Like this isn't going to be a problem at all. How great would that be? But they get injuries like bed sores, you know, sometimes they die from them. So pain evolved, important. Wariness around arachnids. Okay, so I mentioned that, kind of like the snakes, right? Biased food preferences. What does that mean? Well, we have preferences for foods that are very caloric dense, right? We have preferences for foods that are very sweet, those sorts of things. And why would that be adaptive? Well, in an ancestral environment, certainly this would be needed when you have consistent environments that are kind of poor in calories, right? You find something that's high in calories and maybe it's another day of survival, right? So preferences for people that like to eat those things may have evolved that way. And in a modern environment, what do we see? Kind of an evolutionary mismatch, right? Because now we live in an environment where food is extremely abundant, where corporations make food that are extremely palatable, extremely high in calories, sugar, and fats, right? And so people love to eat those, and then they get really fat, right? And probably even related to that is kind of the ease with which people put on weight in these environments. In a very food-poor environment, you know, the desire to eat as much as you can, the desire to eat these really good foods that taste really good, probably adaptive, right? So you're eating enough, because enough is what there is. But in a modern environment, when you just have unlimited access to really high-calorie foods, yeah, people get fat. So we have infant anxiety towards strangers. Why might that be? Well, if a stranger comes to approach the infant that might pose some danger to it, it cries out, can alert the family, the mother and the father, right? It would be both, because of course, you know, pair bonding, co-parenting evolved probably pretty early in hominid history. So it's a warning sign, right? Fear of strangers, to alert the parents in that sense. What else do we have? Modulated infant crying. alerting the parents as well, right? Infants do this instinctively. It's not something that's learned. You don't learn very much as, a little baby, but at least not immediately. They're already crying the moment that they appear into the world. So what else do we have? Spatial orientation device, spatial abilities, right? Those sorts of things. How does that help? Being able to find your way across large territories, for example, because human beings have had a relatively wide range compared to other animals. Some animals might live their entire lives within a square mile. Probably not the case for most human beings, especially in an ancestral kind of hunter-gatherer environment. In modern agrarian environments, you do kind of see that. You can find people that have lived in a very small range their whole lives, but that might not reflect our evolutionary history as closely. And that's important because when you think of these things, you have to think about how might that have evolved in the distant past, when the way that people used to live. It's not always the case that a modern environment, it's going to make sense, the behavior. Intuitive mechanics, okay, yeah, the ability to learn and to use tools. Sense of numbers, perhaps, is another one. The ability to quantify things as well. Core disgust, right? So disgust encompasses a few different things. Disgust of foods is one, right? Being able to taste rotten food and reject it is an example, but also the sensation of disgust that precedes that, right? Being aware that certain things from a distance can be dangerous to an individual, and there are individual differences in this, and something that's called disgust sensitivity. And you see that across different taboos, sexual taboos. You see that related to foods that might be dangerous, particularly taboos for cannibalism, for example, might have arisen out of a kind of danger that posed. You have diseases like Kuru, prion diseases. Do we know that for certain? Not necessarily, but we do see that this core disgust kind of manifests across domains. We have this anti-predator detection device, right? Kind of like the snakes and the spiders. Very basic, that people seem to have an innate instinctive fear of animals that can kill them, okay? Preference for consuming lipids, kind of like I mentioned. We really go for sugary and fat foods, and that would have been adaptive. In the modern environment, maybe not so much, right? And preference for sweets, yeah, we said that. So cheater detection mechanism, this is interesting. This is very interesting, and this is something that's looked at often in the psychology of judgment and decision making, right? We seem to be able to detect unfairness pretty well, and this has even been demonstrated in animals that are closely and a little bit less closely related to us. If you have two dogs perform a task, for example, and you just reward one of them, and the other sees that the other one is being rewarded for the same behavior, they'll act differently. They might get a little bit aggressive, or they might stop doing the task, and human beings are kind of the same way. In situations that are perceived to be unfair, that elicits a response. So we have a bias toward the perceived in-group, right? Probably a really, really important one, in-group biases, right? You have your group, and the survival of your group, the fact that they're going to take care of you, that you're going to take care of them, and all of that probably is really important for individual survival in the long run, right? Similarly, the outgroup, the bias against them, could reflect a history of warfare, right? Strangers who are dangerous. Maybe they want to take something from you. Maybe they want to kill you. They're not going to engage, if we look at something less extreme, they're not going to perhaps engage in altruistic reciprocity with you to the same extent. So the closer people are to you, typically the more of a bias you show in favor of them, and that is kind of graded at every level, right? You see immediate relatives, lovers, friends, then you see kind of like the community and so forth. Eventually maybe it goes to all humanity or whatever. What else do we have as far as adaptations that are related to natural selection? Okay, coalition tracking mechanism, and this is kind of related to the in-group bias, right? That human beings are an extremely cooperative species. We form coalitions with other individuals, and we use that for status, we use that for protection, right? We use that for company. Those are our friends, those are our peer groups, they're the people that we go to school with and work with. All of these are formations of coalitions, and we track those Where are we in a given coalition? How does ours compete against another? How do we get together to dethrone someone else, right? Or to keep someone else down in status? How do we rank in status as an individual within that coalition? These are all things that would be related to survival in that sense as well. This is Machiavellian intelligence. What is that? I think this is basically the capacity to lie, right? The capacity to trick people and that sort of thing. So antisocial behavior, it has its costs and its benefits, and it has continued to persist in human behavior forever despite the downsides. So there's obviously an adaptive function in that sense to some degree of antisocial behavior, and that's even despite what has been called Pinkerian selection, right? From Steven Pinker, the cognitive psychologist. The idea that we have selected over the last few thousand years for more and more pro-social behavior. And how did we do that? Well, we executed criminals, for one. And that was often the case even for small crimes like theft or robbery or something like that, right? Not always for like murder or very violent crimes. People could be hung for stealing. So you have these forces that make trickery, theft, deception dangerous for an individual, but nonetheless, they may be beneficial enough that as far as a strategy for a minority of the population goes, they have persisted anyway. Recognition of facial expressions. So this is a big one. And they've put this under natural selection. So why could that be? Well, if you can't recognize that someone is angry at you or that they're about to attack you, you know, you got a big problem there. You could be jumped, right? In a sense, you could not understand that danger in front of your face was about to happen. But also we see this in primates as well, with their vocalizations and body language. They alert other predators through their own expressions, right? If a monkey sees a snake, it will cry out, it will act in such a way that all of the others around it can recognize through its expression of emotion that there is danger afoot. And so that's very important, being able to read facial expressions. And we see some problems with people who have difficulty in this, particularly with reading fear. We know about this from research with brain lesions, for example. Individuals who experience lesions in the amygdala, they don't experience fear the same, and they don't perceive fear the same. And often they might get into some issues with risk behavior because of that, because they don't avoid dangerous situations as well. So you can see how that has been very important. But additionally, they've put this under natural selection. Let me expand this a little bit to how this can also be sexual selection. Being able to read cues from others, right? Being able to read kind of what's called the vibe, right? And people talk about that. I've seen it recently. Like, what is this vibe thing? Is it magic? It's probably a form of heuristic decision making. And there's a psychologist named Gerd Gerzinger, I believe how you say it, who's written a little bit about this. We make a lot of decisions that we are not aware of, that are a base of heuristic and kind of emotion, right? But some individuals struggle with this as well, and I think related to this is something that's called theory of mind, which is being able to correctly intuit or predict the emotional states of others and the thoughts of others. And this has been called the core deficit in autism by Simon Baron-Cohen, the neuroscientist who has done a lot of research on this topic, perhaps the top researcher in this. He says, theory of mind, core deficit in autism. And what do we see with individuals that have autism? Often they struggle to make friends because of impairments in reading the behavior of others and understanding how they feel in response to your own behavior. And they struggle in romantic relationships for the same reason. So this could also be a feature of sexual selection, right? The ability to read emotions, to know when someone is into you or when they're not, right? What else? Oh, well, immediately after that it says theory of mind mechanism. So I've just described that. We'll skip that. We have threat-induced coalition-seeking bias. So similar to what I said, when individuals feel threatened, they may seek protection from others. They may seek confederates, right, in their group, teammates, to help them contend against the threat, right? Or if they've lost a lot of status, and again we see this in primates, they may try to expand their social group, their coalition. They may switch coalitions as well. And again, it's all kind of a status competition. And of course, how does this come into natural selection? If you're all alone in a very social species, you know, you might get murked, so to speak, right? You might get killed and no one will care. You might not be able to fight off a group of larger monkeys or whatever it may be, apes. And you might also struggle to find resources for yourself if you are very, very low in status, right? If you have no coalition, if you're a loner that way, you know, being the loner sigma male, not what it has been said to be, right? It's not the way that humans usually work. Shame is one, probably, and shame might be a sort of protection against antisocial behavior, an auto-regulation, or what is that English? A self-regulation of antisocial behavior. In that way, if you feel bad for breaking taboos and all of that, you're less likely to do them, and you're less likely to receive punishment from the group in that sense. If you are completely dysregulated, if you have no fear of others, if you have no shame for any of your behaviors, you might break a lot of rules, get in a lot of trouble, and as we mentioned with Steven Pinker, for example, that's the kind of thing that could lead to consequences that are fatal for you. Empathy, right, as well is another one. Being able to understand how others feel. There's different aspects of empathy, and I'm not sure what exactly they're referring to here. You have cognitive empathy, which is a knowledge of how others are feeling, being able to correctly read their emotions, and then you have kind of an affect empathy, which is, you know, someone's hurt and you kind of feel it also. Both can be adaptive in a sense, right? If you need to know if other people are suffering to avoid the same situation for yourself, if they are in your coalition, maybe they're related to you, maybe it's your offspring, your lover, whatever the case may be. If you are not attent to that, you know, maybe they are in serious trouble and they're going to die, and that immediately cuts fitness as well. I think this is also something that's probably related not just to natural selection, but also to sexual selection in that sense. Anti-predator directed gaze reflex. Oh, gosh, that's right on the tip of my tongue. I'm trying to remember what that was. Well, we're going to skip it anyway. Some is sex, okay? Sexual selection. The things that facilitate reproduction directly, traits that are selected for, all of that. And what are those? Well, incest avoidance bias is one. Why? Because incest with close family members over a period of time, yeah, that's something that we have seen, you know, in the Habsburgs and many historical examples, that it doesn't take that many generations of having sex with your sister to end up with children that are infertile, right, that will not continue the line. When individuals are a little bit less closely related, cousins or something like that, then it seems to mitigate it a great deal. But people tend to prefer individuals who are outside of the family, right? And it seems to be very instinctive. And this is also actually related to sensations of disgust. It's kind of a taboo there. What's another one here? Sexual jealousy. And I just made another video on that, I think 1 or 2 videos back. Make sure to check that out. Sexual jealousy, we kind of stigmatize it in society, right? But it is a mechanism involved in pair bonding, right? Retaining a mate, making sure that they don't leave, all of that. Some expressions of sexual jealousy may have been more adaptive in an ancestral environment. In the modern environment, you know, if you have a romantic rival, it's not like you can kill them, right? You can't kill the guy that's going to steal your girlfriend or whatever. It's even, you know, difficult to kind of do mate guarding. You can't really control the behavior of your mate that much. But those are expressions of jealousy, very common ones that people engage in an attempt to retain a mate. But even if you're not kind of jealous of someone that you love, you know, if you don't feel jealous at all, maybe you don't even care about them that much, maybe you don't engage in behaviors that are not cost-inflicting mate retention strategies, but behaviors that are reward-generating mate retention strategies, you know, like spending time with them, showing them attention, letting them know that you love them, and that sort of a thing. So usually there is a little bit of jealousy every now and then when people do love each other, right? It's not like a pathology. And I think in popular culture, we think of jealousy as pathological. Some people experience an extreme pathological jealousy that gets in the way of all of their relationships. Other people deal with it very well, and people in good relationships often manage to kind of reframe and channel that jealousy in a way that actually makes them closer. So pair bonding mechanism, jealousy, sex drive. I've talked about this in recent videos as well. And I'm going to say the same thing. We have animals that have an instinct to reproduce, that have very little as far as we know of a sex drive, right? They might not engage in in sex much at all. They probably don't have much of a libido. A salmon swims upstream, instinct to fertilize the eggs. That's it. It doesn't have a sex life. There is no deep sea tender, right? But human beings don't seem to have a very strong instinct like make baby, right? Human beings have an instinct or a feeling, a drive that says, have sex. I want to be touched by another person. I want to touch another person. I want to experience these physical sensations. And that's what leads to production, or reproduction. So sex in human beings, the desire for it, the bodily organs that we have, all of that has evolved in such a way that sex facilitates reproduction in humans in the way that it doesn't in many animals. Love, next on the list, again, it's the basis for pair bonding, right? Everyone that's talking about pair bonding online, and I see this all the time, do this and she won't be able to pair bond to you, this person pair bonding, that, James Bond, whatever. These people often never discuss the role of love. But if you are concerned about someone being unable to pair bond with you or not being able to pair bond or whatever, what you're really talking about at its core is love, the inability to form an attachment with love that kind of persists. That's kind of a pair bonding impairment there, and probably the core pair bonding impairment, because love is the emotion that has evolved to facilitate pair bonding. And then from pair bonding, of course, you have biparental care, serial monogamy, long-term monogamy, that sort of thing, where you have, a man and a woman raising a child together, facilitating its chances of long-term survival and all of that. So love, pair bonding, the monogamous union, even if it is not a lifelong union, those are all very important things. We have here attachment to a romantic partner. I think kind of what we described goes over that. You have feelings of love, you have feelings of jealousy, you have a desire to want to be close to them as well. All of those are feelings of attachment. You have this male steep future discounting. And what does that mean? I think, I'm trying to remember here, this has to do with a sex difference in men prioritizing immediate rewards over long-term rewards, right? Men might be a little bit more of a short-term planner. Women might be a little bit more of a long-term planner. I have to check on that and make sure, but I think that also ties into some other sex differences we see. Among those, for example, the tendency for men to be much less risk-averse than women on average. Unless you are, a Zoomer or something, see the article on that. We have kind of a risk issue in the youngest generation now, but typically women are more cautious. They're thinking a little bit ahead long term, and some sex differences there. Preference for low morphological fluctuating asymmetry. What does that mean? Oh, and I should go back to the last step because we're talking about sexual selection. How does that come into play as far as sexual selection goes? Well, we know that men are much more open to casual sex, right? Whereas women, casual sex is kind of dangerous for them in that sense, especially, in an ancestral environment. Sex with a stranger, someone that will not provision resources, could be very difficult. You have the 9-month pregnancy, care for the offspring after the fact. And biparental care, therefore, is extremely important, which means planning, picking a mate that is going to be there, right? That has resources to invest in that sense, that even more than just like has resources, but someone who is willing to invest the time, right? And willing to commit to that person long term, because someone could have resources, and if they're not willing to invest time and commitment and all of those things, it doesn't matter at all, does it? So it's not just like a rich guy or whatever. That's often not the case. It's more like rich guy who loves me and who is into me, and I could see like having a future, as far as how this might show in a modern environment. We have this preference for low fluctuating asymmetry. And what is that? We know that facial symmetry very consistently is seen as attractive, right? Symmetrical face. Why? Faces that are less symmetrical may reflect, morphological load in the genes, right? They may reflect mutations that indicate lower genetic fitness. Male preference for sexual variety, kind of mentioned that as far as the future discounting. And the difference in reproduction between men and women, the burdens of it, right? A man, in theory, can impregnate many women and leave, and some of those children are going to survive, even if he invests nothing. So from a reproductive point of view, there isn't a lot of risk for a man to have casual sex. Now, people take this kind of out of context and they think like this is the imperative then. No, that's not something evolutionary psychology has ever said, because there are risks to that, particularly if you are in a relationship, but you're engaging in a lot of extradyadic casual sex, then you can put your relationship at risk, which means that might be a risk to your offspring. So that can actually reduce fitness as well, which is probably why we do see a stronger tendency toward pair bonding and monogamy than we do to just a bunch of casual sex. And even when men are having casual sex, they're usually still open to a long-term relationship. And often what you'll see is not kind of a confirmed bachelor just having a bunch of casual sex, but like someone with a mistress, right? Someone who's seeking a little bit of variety on the side, but who's still trying to kind of maintain a relationship. Male preference for low waist to hip ratio. We see this, but in another, I don't think I made a video, but I've written about this in the past. Recent meta-analyses have indicated that this low waist to hip ratio might not actually indicate actual fertility outcomes, right? So when you ask people, like, what do you value and that sort of thing, they will pick bodies with this kind of waist to hip ratio, this low ratio. But when you look at individuals, I should say, when you look at women and their actual fertility outcomes, how many children have they had? And this is true kind of even cross-culturally, so it's not just like birth control or whatever. It doesn't seem to be actually related to that. So this preference might just be sexual selection for something that's appealing, because not everything involved with sexual selection is actually something that facilitates, I guess I should say, kind of maximizes reproduction, right? Certainly like the peacock's tail is an example of that. In a sense, it does, because it's something that's attractive. But why would having a big tail be beneficial for the peacock? It's probably not beneficial, right? It's probably kind of adverse for it. It actually makes its life a little harder and more dangerous, right? It's more vulnerable with the large tail, but it's a trait that somehow these birds have evolved to really like and prioritize, and they will select the peacock with a fabulous tail, and many birds are like this, even though it's not something that is going to like help it survive in that sense. So waist to hip ratio might be like that, and some elements of male physique, right, facial aesthetics and that sort of thing could also be like that, strictly cosmetic. And that's kind of important to understand too, is that for something to be sexually selective or sexually selected, it doesn't have to provide some kind of survival benefit. It simply has to be attractive, right? That's it. It simply has to be subjectively attractive to the opposite sex. Extra pair copulation bias. Yeah, people don't like in relationships when you have sex with other people. They don't like that. Why? Well, I guess it's obvious, but I'll explain it nonetheless. If someone is investing more time, resources, right, with another person, certainly that's a threat to offspring. So maybe that's the evolutionary basis there. In some animals, we might not actually see like sexual jealousy in that sense. In human beings, we do, right? We see that. We see that there is kind of a tendency to not want your partner to have sex with other people. And it's pretty strong, right? And that's probably related to the fact that, we do form pair bonds, and we have to invest a lot in offspring as well, unlike a lot of other animals. I don't think you see dogs get that jealous if they're having sex with whatever. Many animals don't seem to express it, but human beings, yeah, pretty jealous species, right? Male drive for status. So status is fairly closely linked with reproductive success in hunter-gatherer societies, right? We see the most desirable men, for example, are often kind of portrayed, or the best hunter, or being the best hunter will make you like the most desirable spouse. We don't always see in a modern environment in the West that having a conventionally high status across society is what makes someone the most desirable, but we often do. And status hierarchies are nested, right? So someone might be high status within their individual group, but they might be very poor, a low status individual in society more broadly. So status is very complex, but typically signals of higher status are signs of attractiveness. And one of the famous studies by David Buss, a very cross-cultural view of status found that status cues were pretty consistent cross-culturally across all of these different cultures. So given that status cues were similar, and also that rated by the opposite sex, they were rated, as desirable features, as attractive. You would expect high status to be something that facilitates sexual selection in that sense. What else? This says a female ovulation-induced preference for morphological masculinity. And what the hell does that mean? It means the dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts. And yeah, I've written about this a lot, and the research has not replicated that well, but I'll explain what this is. It is the idea that when a woman is ovulating, when she is in her fertile period, she will express a stronger preference for masculine features, often dimorphic features, right? A more masculine face, that sort of a thing. So this is something that has not actually replicated that well. And there was a very good new paper by Din and Gangstead, the two authors who originated this dual mate hypothesis, okay? And I just wrote a thread on this in Twitter. If you guys follow on Twitter, check that out as well. And they looked at a lot of different hormones related to that, and they said, okay, so this actually seems to be highly moderated by physical attractiveness, and in particular by facial attractiveness as well. So what does that mean? Individuals in relationships, I should say women in relationships, if the person they're in a relationship with is highly attractive, conventionally attractive, right? The desire during ovulation for sex with an extra pair partner, it's basically zero. Boom, it just plummets, right? But when the man is not attractive, when he was about one standard deviation below the mean, then it's much, much higher. And this was also moderated by a general desire for extra pair sex. So it's possible, and this is very controversial, they talk about this in the paper, that despite some of these replications, it's difficult to really track when someone is, when a woman is ovulating well, particularly with a lot of the old methodology. But it's possible that this is an effect that is moderated by current partner attractiveness, right? That when a current partner is not sufficiently attractive, particularly in the face, they didn't even find a relationship between social potency, which is kind of like status, nor bodily muscularity. It was facial attractiveness driven. Then when they are selecting outside, they might be more motivated. So what is the takeaway there? Probably something like be attractive. I don't know. Let's see, what else do we have here? These are features of group adaptation. Genetic relatedness detector. So, a favoritism, a bias for people who are closely related. Being able to identify your own family, right? Altruism biases for kin, right? We are more altruistic toward people we are related to. And why would that facilitate survival, right? Why would evolution select for something like this? Yeah, the more benefits the people who are, genetically related to you have, the more likely it is that your offspring is going to survive, even if they're not your direct offspring, right? Because we have alloparenting, where, close family members, even close friends, take care of your offspring. So again, it's kind of related to coalitions in that sense as well. Olfactory detectation of offspring. So I don't know a lot about this, but I have heard, that mothers can recognize the smell of their own babies. I don't know if fathers are as good as that. And I think that may be what it is referring to. What else do we have? Pregnancy-induced amplification of anti-outgroup bias. So the idea that when a woman is pregnant, she is less accepting of risks from the outgroup, right? She becomes more averse to the outgroup, right? She is more vulnerable. She has more to lose. The outgroup was already threatening in a sense, so that's just kind of heightened during pregnancy in that sense. Sensitivity to step offspring, right? So this is an interesting one, and I think there are some mixtures on how step offspring are kind of provisioned for, but someone goes into a relationship, a man or a woman, and there is another child involved that is not their own. If they have children with that person, if they don't, that's still someone else that they have to invest in, right? And this is certainly something that has filtered into a lot of discourse about dating single mothers and fathers. At the same time, it is something that may have added a little bit of an extra burden, and this might be why we see aversion to dating single mothers, or at least just one reason why, right? Because this is something that is complex in the sense that people can come up with explicit reasons why they don't want to. Even from past experience, they might have thought like, I don't have an aversion to this, it's not a problem. But then they start dating someone who has a kid and they realize, this person doesn't have time for me. They spend a lot of time with the kid. I thought I wouldn't mind, but the ex is coming around. So you have situations like this where people might not experience kind of a visceral aversion toward it at the beginning, but then they kind of learn from experience, like maybe I don't want to date a single parent. Okay, so we have step parents. Great. Now we're going to look at this female ovulation-induced recognition of fear expressions. What does that mean? Potentially, when a woman is ovulating, she is more sensitive to threat. Why? She's more vulnerable, okay? Pretty straightforward that this risk aversion increases with pregnancy. What else do we see? Pregnancy sickness. Probably, again, if we're talking about a psychological mechanism, this may be a desire, or not a desire, I should say, a mechanism to avoid risk. Again, I don't know for sure. But I don't know why they included that pregnancy sickness in this case. That seems to be more of a physiological adaptation or a response to pregnancy. What else do we have? Maternal vocalizations, right? They call it motherese here. What is that? Probably language acquisition and communication with an infant, right? It's something that's instinctive, a way to communicate, kind of a pre-language. And then we also have this infant communication, right? Signaling for resource extraction. And that's kind of something that we mentioned, right? Babies cry. They do it instinctively. They do it when they're hungry, right? And that's the resource extraction in that case, that the baby wants to be fed, so it's going to cry. And it's going to do it in such a way that it evokes a response from the mother. Here are some other things, kind of the last ones we'll go over, and these are a little bit more, they said they were kind of disputed. A language acquisition device, right? Something like a Chomsky universal language, that kind of a thing. The idea that language is innate, right? That we have an innate ability to acquire language. Self-esteem, right? Why? Because it preserves individual functioning, right? If you go through life with very low self-esteem, very depressed or something like that, or if you're not vulnerable to assaults on self-esteem at all, that could also be not beneficial. It says learning system, but it's talking about classical conditioning, right? So yeah, the ability to learn from experience, and you could probably also use instructed conditioning as an example of this, that you can learn through observing aversive reactions from other individuals, instructed or observed. Optimal foraging bias, that people will seek out, again, kind of related to judgment and decision making, that they will seek out kind of the optimal resources in a sense, right? If there's a bunch of strawberries over here and there's only a few over there, you're going to go to where the bunch of strawberries are. You're not going to go picking through the forage for very few in that case. But between the two, people seem to know where to go. Religious propensity. Is religion evolved and innate, and does it have benefits? A lot of debate on this. I'm not going to go into it a great deal, but there do seem to be some heritable components to religious belief, and there seems to be benefits as well. Socially, as far as even reproduction, particularly now in a modern environment, we see that religiosity may be associated with higher fertility. So these are things out there. Fundamental attribution error. This is a cognitive bias. Is this something that's adaptive? I don't really know. Moral judgment bias, musicophilia. So these are things that are kind of disputed. Would they be selected for a desire for music? I can't come up with an explanation, but I'm sure they are out there. But those are things that I'm not quite as familiar with, so I'm not going to speculate too much. Let's go on now to the next slide. So this just kind of shows the taxonomy, and I'm just going to show this to you briefly because I think it's important to understand. Some of these are natural selection, right? They facilitate individual survival, right? If you're not getting killed off, maybe you reproduce, and your genes get passed on. You're a part of the chain of evolution in that sense. Sexual selection, who gets selected to reproduce, and how does the fitness of that offspring increase? Kin selection, right? Selection for a group, which is also kind of controversial, but preferences for kin that do facilitate the survival of individual genes, right? They get passed on. I do think that's probably the thing. And then, the disputed ones that we went over at the very end. So wrapping this up, what are the take-home points? One of those that I would kind of drive home that people like to say is that evolution does not stop at the neck, right? In a lot of discourse, people tend to think that, if you say physical traits or something like that have evolved, people are pretty okay to accept that. And even if you say behaviors in animals are evolved. But when you start talking about human psychology, a lot of people seem to want to think that we are not animals, right? That we are different. That evolution stopped at the neck. That human psychology and behaviors and all of that may not have evolved. That nothing is innate. That we're a completely blank slate. Probably not the case. And it's not just about mate selection. It's a bunch of behaviors, biases, predispositions, and that sort of thing that would have facilitated our survival in an ancestral environment. Some of them still do, and some, as the environment changes, evolution acts on a given environment. So there was a classic example, of the moths, where there were moths, I believe it was in London, turn of the century, and when there was a great deal of pollutant, fog from burning coal or whatever, the white moths stood out more, and you saw selection for the black or the brown moths. And in that case, you see an abrupt change in the environment can also radically change what traits are adaptive, what traits are selected for going forward. So that's very important, that when you look at traits that may have evolved in us, that we are also in a very unique time, speaking, modernity. We have internet, all kinds of strange things going on that are not a part of, 2 million years of hominid evolutionary history in that sense. We have, survival and sexual selection. Important. We tend to think of evolved things, at least in a lot of this relationship evolutionary psychology discourse, as being, all about like what mates get picked. But, there are behavioral traits that have evolved to facilitate survival that are unrelated to that, and they're also very interesting. And also that the survival of the kin and the offspring is very important. We talked about that in the context of kin selection, right? Of evolved behaviors that are beneficial to kin. And why do those help you? Because they're reciprocally beneficial to you as well. But I think there's another point here. It's that a lot of the time people think about like who gets to mate, and that's it. And they don't think about like, okay, who gets to mate, but then what happens to the offspring? Because there are a lot of behaviors that have evolved because they facilitated the survival of the offspring long term, pair bonding, biparental care, and all of that. So I thought this was a cool paper going over just a list of all these things. Some of you, you may have heard of these before, and some you haven't. So I hope you like the video. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. I will make another video for you very soon.